Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC. We're delighted to be joined today by Daniel Sandermann, Head of Europe for Hysata. Hysata is a hydrogen electrolyser company that was spun out of an Australian university. We'll get into the details in a second. Before joining Hysata, he was at Ørsted, and he's got an academic background in science and sustainable energy systems. Daniel, welcome to Energy Unplugged.
Thanks, Hugo.
We're also joined today by James Ha, Aurora's Head of Research in Australia. James is heading up Aurora's work in hydrogen in APAC, and we'll also touch on hydrogen from an APAC perspective today. James, thanks for joining too.
No worries. Good to be here, Hugo.
Daniel, for our US and APAC listeners who are maybe less familiar with trends in European hydrogen markets, maybe can you give us a kind of brief state of the nation as you see the green hydrogen space in Europe at the moment? And I know that's a big question, so we might kind of break that down. So let's start with market size. I mean, where are we now in terms of size of market? And what do you think the growth is looking like over the next decade?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I'd say as being part of the renewable space for about a decade or so, I'll first of all say that it's been quite incredible to just witness this monumental shift that we've experienced in the hydrogen landscape. And now, green hydrogen is like center stage in our efforts to climate change combat. And, the headline for my state of the nation is definitely that the green hydrogen industry in Europe is one filled with ambitions and optimism. Now, in terms of ambitions, I mean, those are both reflected at the regional or European and national level. We see, targets for implementation of renewable hydrogen in the energy systems in the EU, where we want to produce 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen by 2030. Same goes with import. And this ambition level is very much mirrored at the country levels, where we also see expected deployment of multiple gigawatts of electrolyser capacity. I'd say that despite these ambitious and optimistic, this optimistic state of the nation, there's definitely also challenges that we have to overcome. I think, first of all, we've seen regulatory frameworks. While they've been very well intentioned and they try to really accelerate the journey towards more green hydrogen, we have also seen that they have been quite complex and slightly inconsistent when we have looked across the plate recently. A second kind of challenge that we do need to overcome, as I see it, is also that the cost for producing green hydrogen through electrolyzers, they're simply just too high with the current incumbent technologies. Now, this can, of course, partly be explained by this global supply chain crisis that we have witnessed the last years, both due to the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And that has obviously not helped the cost out journey in this sector. But I would say that regardless of these macro events, there is still a fundamental issue with the incumbent technologies, which is the fact that their efficiencies are simply way too low, which means that a large portion of the renewable energy that is used to produce hydrogen, that is simply wasted as heat. In terms of targets or where we are right now, installed capacities, we are still at the megawatts and not the gigawatts. But I would come back to the fact that, ambitions and momentums are moving in the right direction. And I'm definitely seeing on a weekly basis that people are really putting firm commitments into actually building this industry. So, yeah, we are definitely hopeful and very optimistic about the outlook.
And you touched on cost briefly there, but I mean, where are you guys seeing the LCOH of hydrogen at the moment, green hydrogen, and like how much of some of these supply chain issues hit, do you think, in rough percentages?
Well, I mean, in terms of the current LCOH, we are, a factor of X too high still, which is obviously also why we do need regulatory schemes to actually support the development of the industry. It comes very much back to my point just before around efficiency, right? I mean, obviously the capex element is not cannot be understated. Obviously, I mean that is part of the equation, and there we do see a lot of the incumbent technologies being limited. You could say both due to the fact that they haven't been able to drive down cost as they would probably had hoped, but also due to the fact that on a more longer term perspective, their supply chains are very vulnerable in the sense that, for example, for PEM, so proton exchange membrane technologies, they rely on platinum and iridium, which are two of the scarcest and most energy intensive and emission intensive metals that you can get, meaning that driving down cost on these incumbent technologies is definitely going to be a challenge going forward as we see it.
Awesome. So we've touched very briefly on market size and technology costs. In terms of offtake, I mean, where is the offtake coming from in Europe, and which use cases do you see emerging fastest?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that overall the industry, in my perspective at least, really focus on replacing the current green hydrogen usage, which is also very sensible, of course, because from a decarbonization perspective, these applications account for about, I think it's 2% or so of the global emissions, and those use cases include fertilizers and methanol and refining, which actually also is represented at the top level of the ladder, the hydrogen ladder, that I very encourage people to have a look at. Michael Liebrich is the key author there, and that definitely is where we see the most activity evolving around, which again makes a lot of sense. But in addition to this, obviously, hard to abate sectors, which can't reasonably be electrified. I'm an electrical engineer by training, and I can say that I'm probably biased towards electrification where it makes sense. But obviously, there are just simply sectors where you can't economically sensible reach that decarbonization from electrification. So that can be that is very much these use cases around steel making, heavy transport, and I think especially in steel, we've seen some very promising developments in the last years in Europe.
And then finally, in terms of kind of business models or players that you think are particularly well set up in Europe, I mean, who's doing the most, the fastest, and do you see models that you think are going to be most successful over the long term?
Yeah, so as a starting point, I'll just restate that when we look across this green hydrogen landscape, we are very much still in the infancy, and I think broadly speaking, we are making this transition from development / pilots to actually commercializing the industry, and obviously. A key component of actually making or succeeding in this commercialization is to ensure that we have the right technology in place, but even more importantly, probably in our current state, that we also have the end customer demand that will, ultimately drive the industry. And I think in Europe, one recent example of this is H2 Green Steel, a Swedish startup that is building Europe's first green steel plant. And they have really successfully bridged this full value chain of their end product, which has allowed them to actually establish the solid demand for their product. And that is obviously even before they actually have a product, because, I think they are going to be in operation in the coming years. And that way of looking at the business model, this very end-to-end full value chain perspective, is definitely what we also see from the numerous discussions that we are having right now with leading players in the European industry. And you really need this full understanding and coverage of the value chain. That can either be from strong partnerships, but we also do see some players that actually have a group structure that encompasses more or less both the production and the offtake, which obviously allows them to do a kind of balanced risk approach to actually establishing these projects. But again, I mean, it's early days, and a lot will obviously happen towards the end of this decade.
Yeah.
Daniel, I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, could you comment a little bit further there on some of those early movers in this space, particularly in Europe? Do you think that it's more the policy framework and, for example, carbon pricing that is driving that adoption of green hydrogen early on? Or is it more a willingness to pay on the behalf of the buyers who are going to use these low emissions commodities in making, for example, consumer-facing products like cars or phones?
Well, I know that it's probably a bit of a vague answer, but I would argue that it's both, because I mean, it's clear that there are some end use cases where the willingness to pay and the maturity in that sector is simply just too immature right now, and there obviously we need to stimulate that development via different funding schemes. But I would say that we are seeing some very bullish and needed plays from industry leaders in their fields. I mean, just to mention another great example of actually putting their necks out there and leading. Well, then Maersk, the Danish shipping group, have recently, first of all, deployed their first methanol fueled tanker, and have now also co-ventured their own kind of green methanol entity to ensure that they can actually fuel their own ships. So I mean, there's a lot of very promising activity out there, but yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of market creators getting out there and actually innovating on the business model, just as we've seen H2 Green Steel and now also Maersk.
Let's maybe turn to Hysata. And, I'm particularly excited about this because there are not, infinite startups that come out of Australian unis that are really kind of hard green tech. So I think Hysata is particularly exciting as someone who primarily lives in Australia. Again, I'm sure there's a lot going on at the company. So let's maybe break it down a little bit and just start with the technology. Could you just talk to us through what's unique about the Hysata offering? And I suppose, what is its kind of point of difference?
Yeah, certainly. So I guess that the headline for Hysata is that we are a technology company and we are commercializing the best electrolyzer in the world. I understand that that's a substantial claim, but it is, however, a claim that is firmly grounded in our transformational electrolyzer design. And there is kind of three unique features of our electrolyzer. First of all, it has an ultra-high system efficiency of 95%, which, compared to incumbent technologies who are the best at 75% system efficiency, is a huge improvement and a quantum leap in performance. Second, due to our intrinsically simple design, we have a vastly simplified balance of plant. So basically the system that makes the electrolyzer perform as you would like it to. And that leads to a very low system capex. And then lastly, our design is perfectly suited for mass manufacturing and scalability. And it also has no reliance on rare earth materials, as we rely on nickel as an which is an earth abundant material. And summing up these characteristics, you'll simply get the best electrolyzer in the world, which will deliver a disruptive change in the price of green hydrogen. That's kind of the short story.
And I mean, maybe talk a little bit about the journey, because my understanding was the technology was developed at the University of Wollongong, which is a regional Australian university. I mean, what does the journey look like for a technology like this from the labs at Uni of Wollongong to being deployed at least megawatt scale in parts of Australia?
Yeah, so if we start with how the company was actually born, I mean, we had our technology developed by a team from the University of Wollongong, which was led by our CTO, Professor Jerry Swiegers. And Jerry and the team, they really wanted to create this much needed quantum leap in electrolyzer performance, which certainly they did. And basically this effort have already been recognized at the global stage with the publication in our, Nature Communications paper, which then subsequently was verified by a leading electrochemistry expert, Professor Dan Brett of University College of London. And yeah, I really encourage any listener who wants to get into a bit more of the science behind our technology to dive in and read this article. But yeah, so basically we broke stealth as a company with the publication of this Nature Communications paper, and really officially launched in June 21, where we did our Series A funding round of I think it was about 42.5 million Australian dollars. And here we brought in Virescent Ventures led the round on behalf of CEFC. We had Kiko Ventures from the UK, iPre Group in Australia, Vestas Ventures, so Vestas, the largest wind turbine OEM, their ventures part went in, Host Plus, and also Blue Scope was also part of this round, and that basically gave us, the first acceleration of this great technology, which as I said, is truly groundbreaking and is very much going to deliver this much needed quantum leap in technical innovation in the electrolyzer space. And I think if we look at, the incumbents here and the history of electrolyzers is, the statement around it was a much needed innovation. It really is true. I mean, this industry has, in many ways been evolved, from a cottage industry where there has been, very little emphasis on mass manufacturability. It's been incremental improvements. And just starting with the alkaline technology, which is the oldest technology that was commercially available, has been commercially available for multiple decades. It's in essence only seen small incremental improvements, where I think like the largest breakthrough was in the 70s, where they invented the zero gap alkaline technology, and that obviously brought up the efficiency. And then, we waited a couple of decades, and then the PEM, the proton exchange membrane, came along in the 90s. And again, they actually were able to eliminate bubble generation on one side of the cell. But again, it was still, you could argue a slightly incremental innovation. And coming back to these bubbles, well, they are very much the major source of resistance in an electrolyzer, both because they are non-conducting, and then they also mask the electrodes, which limits the efficiency. And here again, Jerry and the team, they basically set out with the key question on how on earth do we actually eliminate those bubbles, and that is actually one of the very innovative approaches with our technology. We do eliminate bubbles. Our technology is called capillary fed electrolysis, and that is simply because we use a capillary, which essentially acts as a sponge to draw the water into the cell, and that essentially eliminates bubbles, which then reduces the cell electrical resistance. And this very low resistance and the fact that we really have no bubbles, that collapses the resistance in the cell, and actually, delivers this 95% system performance, which again should be compared to this 75% performance of the best incumbent technology, and actually takes us to the performance, which is, beyond IRENA's energy efficiency target for electrolyzers for the year 2050. So, definitely a huge leap in performance.
That's all super interesting. And, Hysata's certainly been in the news here in Australia. You're launching a 5 megawatt system in Port Kembla, which is on the New South Wales coast. 20 million in funding from ARENA, the Australian grants agency for clean energy, and it's a $50 million project. Like, what do you guys get out of that? I suppose, is it proving that you can achieve these 95% efficiency rates at megawatt scale projects? Is that the primary purpose, I suppose?
Yeah, well, certainly that's a key part of this project. I think, as you rightly said, we've recently moved into this new HQ in Port Kembla, and part of the exercise there is very much setting up our first 100 megawatt pilot manufacturing line, which we will have operational in 25, and that is basically the same year that we'll deploy this first commercial 5 megawatt system in our project with Stanwell. And first of all, as far as our manufacturing line goes, we will quickly scale this towards the gigawatt scale, which will definitely serve as a blueprint for our ramp up of manufacturing, which will include multiple gigawatts of manufacturing capacity before the end of this decade. And now specifically for the 5 megawatt system, that is exactly as you say, Hugo. I mean, it will allow us to showcase this transformative technology at a commercial scale in a real life environment, and obviously also provide us with some important data to support the multiple megawatts and gigawatt scale projects that we have in our pipeline already.
And I suppose, I mean, in some ways, Australia is an obvious site given the background of your company, and Port Kembla is near to Wollongong for those who are not familiar with the geography of regional Australia. Have there been any thoughts about going elsewhere? Like, I mean, I'm thinking particularly here, the US, just given the incentives under the IRA, and maybe that's just further down the line and you need this 5 megawatt site first. But was it always the plan to start in Australia for the trial site?
Yeah, so I mean, we are definitely going to be a global company. I mean, again, we believe we have the best technology in the world, so we obviously want to bring that to the whole world. But Australia is also a key market for us, first of all, and then obviously coupled with the fact that we wanted close proximity to our tech team, just made it very natural to deploy our first unit here.
I mean, you kind of touched on this, like what you want to achieve by the end of the decade, but what does success look like for you guys over a 5 or 10 year horizon? Is it kind of gigawatt scale plants in the ground by, say, 2030, 2035?
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, if we just look 5 years ahead, we do have a clear aspiration and strategy to take a leading position in the electrolyzer space. Again, I mean, we have the world's best technology. We have a huge market pool. I mean, we have more than 10 gigawatts worth of conditional pre-orders signed with the customers, and a pipeline of multiple gigawatts that I and my colleagues are currently discussing with partners. So getting from where we are now to the multiple gigawatts is, of course, no straightforward task. I mean, we are very comfortable that we will be able to deliver, and that is first and foremost due to our incredible team. And now, if I should just single out one team member, our VP of Engineering, Scott Abrahamson, has a incredible track record in high tech, high quality, and high volume manufacturing. Most recently, he was with Apple, and actually Hysata's electrolyzer will be his 30th product launch. So we are really in safe hands, I guess you can say, from an engineering and growth perspective. And he and the team is just doing a great job of going from this lab scale unit to a fully commercial system. So we just look very much forward to delivering that. And I think that for us, success in the near and long term is very clearly defined. We want to make sure that we deliver as many gigawatts of electrolyzers to the world as possible. And that's obviously not only because it will be highly value creating for our business and shareholders, but just as important because we really want to deliver on our mission, which is to accelerate the world's shift away from fossil fuels to green hydrogen.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, imagine there's a very different set of skills as a company like Hysata evolves, right? Like taking it from the lab to megawatts to gigawatts, and
Definitely.
Different people are relatively more important at different stages of that journey. So we've kind of hit on Europe there, and we've talked about Hysata. Maybe if we could turn to APAC. James, Aurora's launching a hydrogen subscription service in APAC. We have one in Europe, but we felt like there was a kind of gap there in terms of integrated analytics of what was happening in the hydrogen space in APAC. I suppose, again, at a high level to start across APAC, which is again incredibly diverse, heterogeneous region, it feels like the EU is further along the journey. Like governments have already thrown real dollars at real projects. US rapidly catching up, given the famous $3 per kilo tax credits. APAC, lots of announcements, lots of MOUs, but less steel in the ground is, I think, the consensus view. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's pretty fair, Hugo. So one of the things that we've analyzed for a while at Aurora is what the pipeline of electrolyzers looks like globally. And it really does feel like we're at the start of the S-curve here. So we're almost at the stage where we've got about 1 gigawatt of operational electrolyzers globally, and most of these are at the megawatt scale. And yet, in our pipeline, we've seen more than 1 terawatt hour of projects announced. That's just the electrolyzers, let alone the renewables that would be needed to power them. And most of those announcements are very, very early stage. The industry is still very nascent. So if we exclude projects that are literally just announcements and look at the ones that are a bit further along the development pipeline, we see about 180 gigawatts of those planned, and almost half that capacity is expected to be built in Europe. In APAC, it's more like 20% of that number, and that's despite APAC, accounting for most of the world's population. And really, this is, we think, mostly a reflection of the two continents' decarbonization journeys. So the EU is just further along. It's got that carbon pricing mechanism. It's encouraging hard to abate sectors to start planning now for how they'll eventually transition to low emissions processes, even in sectors like steelmaking. In APAC, those conversations are just at an earlier stage.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe a question for both of you guys, in terms of what the real government support looks like. It does seem like governments are taking quite different approaches. So I already touched on, for example, the US, where they've got a ratchet mechanism based on the carbon intensity of the hydrogen, and you can ratchet that up to $3 per kilo US, which is a really sizable subsidy. Japan has an emerging national hydrogen strategy where it looks to subsidize the difference between hydrogen production costs and a gas best benchmark. Like, I suppose, which countries are doing the best job of this? Are there any particular innovative structures you see? Daniel, maybe you want to go first here.
Yeah, certainly. So I think starting at the EU level, I think that the recent announcement of the hydrogen bank auction that will take place November 23rd is very encouraging as a new mechanism and very much trying to accelerate the growth of hydrogen in renewable hydrogen in Europe. And there we are seeing a cap of €4.5 per kilo of hydrogen, and obviously it's starting as a pilot with in quotation mark only €800 million allocated, which is obviously a lot of money, but in terms of what we need to achieve, still obviously nowhere near the level of subsidies that will be necessary to accelerate the transition. I think that what we're seeing, at least as an OEM and an upcoming OEM, is that we do see a lot of national support and eagerness to bring manufacturing locally, which obviously is also seen at the European level. So there we can at least see a large appetite, not without naming any specific countries, because don't want to step on anyone's toes. But I think that we do see a large appetite to support the development and obviously also bring the production locally.
Maybe to add to that, Daniel, as well, when we look across the different markets where Aurora operates across the world, one of the nice things about Europe does seem to be this H2 global instrument, where we're starting to see both producers and consumers of hydrogen brought together. And, the mechanism is effectively auctions on both sides. So, the lowest cost producers would win contracts, the buyers that are willing to pay the highest price would win contracts. And then there's effectively a market-making intermediary in the middle that provides a subsidy to close the gap. And that's quite a neat mechanism that kind of functions like a CFD structure, but split across two auctions. I'm not sure, Daniel, if you've seen if Hysata is participating.
Yeah, well, we aren't participating per se right now, but obviously our partners and customers are highly involved in these market making mechanisms. So, and obviously, as we evolve our commercialization journey, then we'll definitely also be part of these discussions even closer.
I do enjoy these kind of auction design questions. I think it was Paul Klemperer at Oxford who was the kind of godfather of auction design. And I once took a class of his. I didn't understand a lot of it. It seems like some quite complicated maths, but it is super interesting. And it is good to see these kind of different and innovative approaches occurring, because I suspect, there's some competitive tension, and we'll see the kind of best design emerge over time. James, maybe a question for you, and it's potentially just because I've come back from a trip from Japan where, a lot of the conversations, even when you're talking just purely about electricity markets, come back to green hydrogen and green ammonia. And, I think the way it'll evolve in Japan is they will take a portfolio approach. There'll be some domestic production capabilities, and then they'll try to diversify the suite of sellers that they are buying from. But there's, I think, generally just a high degree of skepticism about kind of hydrogen exports into places like Japan because of both the cost and some of the technical difficulties with facilitating cross-border hydrogen flows. I suppose, what's our take here on the APAC region as to how this will play out?
Yeah, great question, Hugo. So, notably between Australia and Japan, that is the trade route that saw the world's first shipment of liquefied hydrogen, which happened about 18 months ago in early 2022. And so effectively in Victoria, in Australia, some hydrogen was produced from brown coal gasification, cooled down to minus 253 degrees, converted to liquid, and then shipped across to Japan. And, while that kind of demonstrated that this is technically a thing that is possible to do, it's certainly not a cheap way to move energy around the world, given the expense of liquefying at such a cold temperature. So, almost 100 degrees colder than what's needed for LNG, and the relative lack of experience that we have in moving liquid hydrogen around the world, plus the risk of boil off. Hydrogen is a notoriously difficult molecule to contain, so some losses en route. So we're seeing a lot more interest in alternative vectors to move hydrogen around. And the two main ones that a lot of our clients talk to us about at the moment are ammonia and liquid organic hydrogen carriers. Now, if we start with ammonia, one of the key benefits there is that it's already a widely traded commodity, and you can liquefy it at either minus 33 degrees, so relatively warm compared to both LNG and hydrogen, or just by compressing it to under 9 bars of pressure. But the drawback there with using ammonia as a vector is the cost of conditioning and reconditioning. So you can produce green hydrogen, but you've then got the added cost of taking that green hydrogen, combining it with nitrogen to make ammonia. And then at the destination country, if ammonia is not the desired product, you've then got to crack that molecule to get the hydrogen back. So adds quite a lot of expense on both ends. But there are some uses for ammonia. And so in situations where ammonia itself is the desired product, shipping that molecule could be quite an attractive option. So we've done some analysis looking at different markets that might produce this molecule and the cost of landing it in Japan. And we see Australia as being quite competitive on the fundamentals. For example, Australia would be about 40% cheaper than producing ammonia domestically in Japan in a green way over the coming decades. And we would see Australia outcompeting other countries in APAC and even some countries that are generally seen to be quite competitive hydrogen producers, such as Chile or the Middle East or even the US. But that's just on the fundamentals. That's based on the renewable resource that we've got and forecasts for electrolyser capex, opex, those sorts of things. Once you start to factor in subsidies and the policy regimes, the story is a bit less clear. So as you mentioned, Hugo, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US could see some projects see a subsidy of up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen. If that project meets both emissions limits as well as wage requirements, and takes advantage of all of the different tax credits that you can earn on renewable electricity generation as well. So that would make some of the best sites in the US a bit more competitive than Australia. And the real question is, would Australian projects be able to match that via our own hydrogen Head Start program, which the federal government is looking to spend $2 billion on? So it is a little bit of a race to see which policy mechanisms will deliver lowest cost hydrogen in the near term. But again, on the long-term fundamentals, we see Australia as being a very competitive place to make this molecule in the APAC region.
And when you say fundamentals, like what kind of business models are you talking about there? Is it like grid connected or islanded? What are we looking
for sure.
at?
So for green hydrogen production, there's basically three models that we see in Australia. And so that would be co-located with renewables, but islanded from any of the main grids that we've got in Australia. The second business model would be co-located with renewables, but still preserving a grid connection. So you can either take electricity from the grid when it's cheap to do so, or export some of the co-located renewable power to the grid when the wholesale electricity price is high enough that it's worth switching off your electrolyser and just selling power straight into, for example, the national electricity market. And then the third business model would just be pure grid connection, where you would then demonstrate your green credentials through buying green certificates rather than using any sort of co-located renewable resource. And to give you a sense for the costs of these different business models, in 2030, we would see a levelized cost of hydrogen in Australia of somewhere between $3.6 to $5.6 per kilogram. Now, of those business models, the grid-connected business model shows much less variability than the islanded business models, because if you're building an islanded project, the costs are going to be very sensitive to the local quality of renewable resources. And Australia is a huge place. There's some parts of the country that have fantastic co-located wind and solar, and that's where you're starting to get down to the low end of that LCOH range. And then other places that where the renewable resource is just not as good, or you can't take advantage of wind and solar to the same extent. You might be relying just on onshore wind, for example, and they tend to come out a bit more expensive. So I guess in general, overall in the near term, we are finding that having a grid connection is quite important, while electrolyzers remain a relatively expensive part of the overall project. Because you do want to run them at a decent enough load factor to kind of amortize the fixed costs of the project over more kilograms of production.
Super interesting. I am conscious of time here, but kind of Aurora's speciality is power market modeling, although we do increasing work in hydrogen. Implications for power markets. There's a lot of debate in Australia. I see some very aggressive demand forecasts for our electricity system, assuming grid-connected hydrogen. What kind of takeaways would you pull out quickly?
Yeah, for sure. Well, Hugo, we had Richard Bolt and Chris Grieg on the podcast recently to talk about the Net Zero Australia and Net Zero America work. And that forecasted or projected that Australia could need an area the size of Tasmania covered in wind turbines and solar panels to supply what they thought was a reasonable share of Australia's role in supplying hydrogen to the world. Now, the forecasts for Australia, even from our grid operator, do move around quite a lot, but some of these forecasts would see power demand increase by a factor of 4 or even 6 in our national electricity market. That's obviously a huge amount of extra demand. I mean, even if everyone were to use Hysata's technology and get a 95% efficiency, I'm assuming, Dan, if you're talking about 95%, and apologies for the numbers, but I'm sure our listeners aren't too concerned about getting into the weeds here. But that's about, I imagine, 41 kilowatt hours of electricity per kilogram of hydrogen, which
Correct.
Scale it up by 1 billion. Awesome, good to get the confirmation from the experts here. So that's about 41 terawatt hours of power demand per million tons of hydrogen production. We talked earlier about Europe wanting to see 10 million tons of hydrogen consumption. That's going to require 400 terawatt hours, or basically 2 Australia's worth of electricity demand. So, a huge amount of power to go into this. And the real question for our grids is whether or not the generation and the network infrastructure that we've got can keep up with that growing demand. So if it can't, then rapid electricity demand is just going to put more strain on our networks and likely lead to elevated wholesale electricity prices. But if we can get the network infrastructure in, and it is possible to build enough renewable generation to keep up with that demand, and if the electrolyzers can act in a somewhat flexible way, then potentially this green hydrogen industry could help to smooth out some of the volatility that we see in energy-only markets like Australia. And this is very much going to be subject to the ability to store hydrogen economically so that it can kind of act as the buffer between variable load factors, taking energy off the grid, and the off-takers of hydrogen that are likely going to want regular, stable deliveries of that molecule.
Awesome. I think it's a great summary of the state of play of hydrogen in Australia and wider APAC. Daniel, maybe a couple of kind of rapid fire questions for you just to finish off. We try and ask these in every episode, but is there kind of one out of consensus view that you hold on the future of hydrogen? So I suppose we're asking you to calibrate here against conventional wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess one that pops into mind, of course, and maybe not surprisingly based on our discussion today, is that I do believe that there is going to be a larger consolidation in the electrolyzer space towards the end of this decade, simply because performance and general characteristics of these incumbent technologies won't cut it for where we are headed.
And then the final question, who do you read or listen to in the energy space that is always good, thought-provoking, and relevant to your work in the private sector?
Yeah, well, as I told you earlier, well, first of all, enjoy the great work that you're doing here in Energy Unplugged. But I guess that people listening in are already listeners. But keep up the good work. Really find it useful. And then, I of course need to give a bit of a shout out to our team members. So I would definitely suggest reading the book Powering Up by the former chief scientist, Alan Finkel, who's actually also the chair of our global advisory. And while we're at the global advisory, I'd also give a bit of a shout out to our newest member, Michael Liebrick, who has a brilliant podcast called Cleaning Up, which I definitely think is a must to listen to if you're interested in the energy space in general.
Yeah, I love Michael's podcast. Very punchy. Daniel, an enormous thank you for your time. We've covered a huge amount there, both about European hydrogen, but also about Hysata and the exciting work you and the team are doing. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And James, thank you for the insights on APAC hydrogen.
No worries. Thanks, Hugo.
That was Daniel Sandermann, head of Europe for Hysata, talking to Hugo Batten, managing director of Aurora in APAC, and James Haar, Aurora's head of research in Australia. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.